The light was red at the corner of 72nd and Dodge in Omaha, Nebraska, on a Thursday afternoon in late August, and I was sitting in the cab of my Peterbilt 379 watching the heat shimmer off the hood, when the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen in my life pulled up beside me in a red Honda Civic with a broken side mirror and a bumper sticker that said, "I'd rather be somewhere else." I noticed the bumper sticker first. That's the honest version. Then I noticed her. She was maybe 30, with dark hair pulled back in the specific way that suggests it was pulled back because she was busy, and not because she was trying to look a certain way, which is a distinction that matters and that I noticed at the time without being able to articulate why. She was looking straight ahead at the red light, one hand on the wheel, the other holding a coffee cup, with the expression of a woman conducting an internal conversation that the traffic light was interrupting. She didn't look up at the Peterbilt. Most people in cars don't. You're too far below the cab, the angle is wrong, and the social convention of not making eye contact with the driver of an 18-wheeler at a red light is apparently universal. She looked straight ahead at the light. I looked at her for the duration of the red, which in Omaha, on a Thursday afternoon at 4:15 p.m., is approximately 90 seconds, because the Dodge Street corridor has the longest light cycles in the city, a fact I knew from having sat at this particular intersection probably 200 times in 8 years of running the I-80 corridor through Nebraska. The light turned green. She pulled away. I pulled away. She turned south on 72nd. I went straight on Dodge toward the I-80 on-ramp. And that was that. The complete transaction. 90 seconds at a red light, a woman in a red Civic with a broken mirror and a bumper sticker, gone. Except I thought about her for the next 400 miles. I want to tell you something about long drives and the specific quality of thinking they produce, because it matters for understanding what happened next. When you're on a long, empty stretch of highway, the I-80 through Nebraska at dusk, the corn on both sides as tall as the cab windows in August, the sky enormous and going from blue to the particular orange-pink that Nebraska does at the end of a summer day, your mind does something that it doesn't do when you're sitting still. It follows things out. It takes a thread, and it follows it without interruption, without the small demands of a stationary life cutting it off until the thread runs its course or the road ends. I followed the thread of that woman for 400 miles, not obsessively, not in the way that suggests something unhinged. Just she'd been there, and the bumper sticker had been funny, and something about the internal conversation she was having with herself at that red light had a quality I recognized, the quality of a person who is genuinely somewhere else in their head even when they're sitting still, and I knew that quality because it's mine. And people who have it recognize each other the way people who speak the same language recognize each other in a country where nobody else speaks it. I made my delivery in Lincoln. I fueled in York on the return. I was back at the I-80 on-ramp in Omaha at 11:30 that night. And as I came through the interchange, I passed through the 72nd Street exit, and I thought, I will never see her again, and that is correct and fine, and I should stop thinking about a woman I spent 90 seconds looking at through a windshield. I stopped thinking about her for about a week. If you've ever been the kind of person who doesn't fall easily, who has spent enough years moving that stillness feels like a problem to be solved rather than a state to be sought, you know what it means to stop thinking about something. It doesn't mean the thing is gone. It means you've put it in the pocket where you put things that don't have an immediate use, and you've closed the pocket and you've continued doing what you're doing. The pocket doesn't empty itself. You just stop reaching into it. I reached into it about once a day for a week. If you've ever been sitting at a red light thinking you were somewhere else in your head and found out that somebody spent 400 miles following that thread, subscribe right now because this story is for you. And if you're the kind of person who thinks that's not enough to build a marriage on, stay with me, because I've got a year's worth of evidence that suggests otherwise. My name is Joe Decker. I'm 47 years old, and I've been driving the I-80 corridor between Omaha and Denver for 11 years. Before that, I drove regionally out of Des Moines for 3 years. And before that, I drove a delivery route in Cedar Rapids for 2 years because I needed the CDL hours and the local job was what was available. 16 years total behind the wheel, counting everything. The Peterbilt 379. I was driving that August afternoon I'd owned for 6 years. Bought it from a retiring owner-operator in Council Bluffs who'd kept it meticulously and who shook my hand on a price that was fair and said, "Take care of it and it'll take care of you." I've been taking care of it. I'm from Ames, Iowa, originally. Grew up there. Went to community college for 2 years studying business administration because it seemed practical. Dropped it when I realized that what I meant by practical was something other than what business administration was offering. Found my way to driving through a cousin who ran a flatbed operation out of Ankeny and who needed help during a surge period in 2008, which was an odd time for a surge, but it happened. And I discovered in the first 3 weeks that the road suited me in a way that the classroom and the office hadn't. I'd never been married. By the time I was sitting at that red light in Omaha in August, I was 39 years old, and I had been in 2 relationships that had ended for the same basic reason, which is that the road and a relationship are in fundamental tension when only one person is on the road and the other person is home, and resolving that tension requires a kind of ongoing communication that I hadn't mastered and that, in honesty, I hadn't tried hard enough to master because the road was always easier than the conversation. I knew that about myself. I'm not telling you this as a confession. I'm telling you because you need to understand the inventory I was carrying in that cab when the light turned red on Dodge Street. 39 years old, 16 years driving, 2 relationships that had ended at the intersection of absence and silence. A Peterbilt I could describe in more detail than I could describe most people I knew. And 400 miles of Nebraska corn and August sky still ahead of me. That was the man at the red light. The second time I saw her was 3 weeks later at the same intersection. I know how that sounds. I know the statistical improbability of it, and I knew it at the time, and my initial response was not romantic. It was the specific surprise of a man who recognizes a face he wasn't expecting to see and needs a moment to place it. I'd seen her once, for 90 seconds 3 weeks earlier. The brain files things in the way the brain files things, and when the red Civic pulled up beside me again on a Thursday afternoon at almost exactly the same time, I recognized the car before I recognized her. She was on the phone this time, not holding it, earpiece, hands-free, talking to someone about something that seemed, from her expression, to be a conversation she'd rather not be having. Her free hand was doing the thing that people's hands do when they're saying something emphatic and the person on the other end of the line can't see them. Small, emphatic gestures that are for the speaker's benefit, not the listener's. She still didn't look up at the Peterbilt. I had 90 seconds, and I did something that I have since described to various people who have had various reactions, ranging from admirable to concerning. I reached into the cab, took a page from the notepad I keep for load notes, wrote my name and phone number and the word "saw you here 3 weeks ago," best bumper sticker on Dodge Street, folded it twice, and when the light turned green and she started to pull away, I knocked on the passenger window of my cab. Not her window, the cab window, to get her attention. She looked up. I held up the note. She looked at it. The car behind her honked. She pulled away. I watched her in my mirror. She hadn't taken the note. I drove to Lincoln feeling like a man who had just done something that confirmed his suspicion that he was not, fundamentally, equipped for the civilian world. The note was still in my hand. I put it in the ashtray I use as a miscellaneous holder, and I told myself that was the correct outcome, that reaching out to a stranger at a traffic light through a cab window with a handwritten note was not a behavior that a reasonable person should expect to receive gracefully, and that the absence of a response was the road's way of telling me to focus on the freight. I focused on the freight for 2 days. On the third day, my phone rang from an Omaha number I didn't recognize. I was parked at a rest area east of Grand Island, eating a sandwich with the CB on low and the August heat pressing against the windshield. I answered it. "Is this Joe?" A woman's voice. Careful. The voice of someone who has dialed a number they weren't sure about and is deciding how to proceed based on the first syllable. "Yes," I said. I'm the Honda Civic, the bumper sticker." I put the sandwich down. Her name was Claire Hennessy. She was 31 years old. She worked as a project manager for a construction firm in Omaha, and she drove the 72nd and Dodge route every Thursday afternoon because she had a standing appointment with her therapist 3 blocks north of that intersection, which explained both the regular appearance and the internal conversation I'd observed at the light. She said, "How did you know I'd be there the second time?" "I didn't," I said. "I'm at that intersection most Thursdays because I pick up my I-80 on-ramp there. It was a coincidence." A pause. "That's either very believable or the best possible lie." "It's the truth," I said. "I don't have the patience for the best possible lie." She laughed. It was a short laugh, surprised, genuine, the kind that escapes before the person decides whether to let it out. I noted it. "The note said 3 weeks ago," she said. "You remembered the bumper sticker." "I remembered everything," I said. "And then, because 39 years of moving had at least taught me not to waste a clear shot, I thought about you for 400 miles. Another pause, longer this time. "That's either romantic or unsettling," she said. "Probably both," I said. "I'm a truck driver. We have a lot of time to think." She laughed again, less surprised this time. We talked for 47 minutes. I know the exact time because I was at a rest area with a delivery window in Lincoln that I needed to respect, and I was watching the clock while also not watching the clock, which is a specific kind of divided attention that I'd never previously associated with a phone call. She told me about the project management job, about growing up in Council Bluffs across the river, about why the bumper sticker was on her car. I told her about the road, about Ames, about the Peterbilt. She asked how long I'd owned it. I told her 6 years. She said, "You talk about it like it's a person." I said, "It's more reliable than most people I know." She said, "That's either a very good sign or a very bad one." I said, "I've been trying to figure out which one for 6 years." We made a plan to meet the following Saturday at a diner in Omaha that she knew and I'd been to twice, the kind of diner that's been operating since the 1970s, and that has pie that's better than it has any right to be, and coffee that's worse, and that smells like both simultaneously in a way that shouldn't work but does. I was at the diner at noon on Saturday, which was 30 minutes early, and I sat in a corner booth and drank the bad coffee and looked at the door, which is something I hadn't done in a very long time. The waitress, a woman named Pat, who'd clearly been working that counter since the diner opened, based on the specific authority with which she moved through the room, refilled my coffee without being asked and said, without any particular inflection, "Waiting on someone?" I said yes. She said, "First date?" I said, "Something like that." She looked at me with the particular assessment of a woman who has watched a lot of first dates from behind a counter. "You're early," she said. "That's a good sign." "Or it means I was nervous and left the house too soon," I said. She smiled. "Also a good sign." She moved on to the next table. I sat with the bad coffee and the good smell and the door, and I thought about what Claire had sounded like on the phone, the careful quality of her first sentence, deciding whether to proceed based on the first syllable, and then the loosening of it as the call went on. I thought about the 47 minutes, which was longer than any phone call I'd had with someone I'd never met in person. I thought about the bumper sticker and the broken mirror and the internal conversation I'd observed from 12 feet above her at a red light. I thought, if this goes wrong, it goes wrong. The worst outcome is coffee and an hour and a drive back to the yard. That's not a bad worst outcome. Claire Hennessy walked in at 12:07, and I watched her scan the room and find me, and the expression on her face when she found me was the expression of a person confirming that the thing they thought they were walking into is, in fact, the thing they're walking into. She sat down across from me. "You're taller than I thought," she said. "You're exactly what I thought," I said. She tilted her head slightly, the gesture of someone recalibrating. "Is that good?" she said. "It's the best possible thing," I said. Pat appeared at the table with menus and looked at us both with the practiced non-expression of a person who has seen this moment many times and knows enough not to interrupt it prematurely. She set the menus down and left. We talked for 3 hours. I don't remember the full inventory of what we talked about, which is unusual for me. I have a reasonably good memory for conversations, especially the ones that matter. But I remember the quality of it more than the content. It had the quality of a conversation that's finding its own level, going deeper without being pushed, the way water finds the lowest point without being directed there. She asked questions that suggested she'd been paying attention to things I'd said on the phone and had thought about them further. I asked questions that I'd wanted to ask since the phone call and hadn't had the natural opening for. At one point, she asked what the hardest part of the job was. Not the physical part, not the logistical part, the hardest part. I thought about it for a real moment, not a performative one. "Coming back," I said. "The transition. You've been in the road world, which has its own logic and its own rhythm, and then you're back in the regular world, and the two don't line up immediately. It takes a day, sometimes 2. She nodded slowly. "Do you tell people that?" "Not usually." "Why not?" "Because it sounds like a complaint about coming home, and it isn't. It's just a description of how the transition works." She looked at me for a moment. "That's important to know," she said. "If someone was waiting for you." I looked at her. "Yes," I said. "It is." Pat brought the pie at some point in the second hour. Neither of us had ordered it. She'd just brought it. 2 slices of something with apples, and she set them down without ceremony and moved on. We ate the pie and kept talking, and outside the diner the November Omaha afternoon went from bright to grey in the way that November afternoons do, and neither of us commented on it. We left at 3:15. She had a thing at 4, something with a friend. She'd mentioned it on the phone. We stood on the sidewalk outside the diner for a moment in the cold. "This was good," she said. "Yes," I said. "I'd like to do it again." "Saturday after next," I said. "I've got a Denver run Friday. I'll be back by noon." She looked at me, the recalibrating look again. "You planned that." "I planned the return time," I said. "The Saturday was a guess." She smiled. Not the surprised laugh, something quieter. "Saturday after next," she said. She walked to her car, which was parked half a block down, and I watched her go, and then walked to the Peterbilt, which was in the lot across the street, and I sat in the cab for a few minutes before I started it. Pat had been right. Early was a good sign, not because it indicated anything specific about me, but because it indicated that something had mattered enough to leave the house too soon, and something mattering is where everything starts. Now let me tell you about a conversation that happened 6 months after the wedding, on a run I was doing solo on the I-80 through Nebraska, that I've thought about regularly since. I was westbound, somewhere between Lincoln and Grand Island, at about 2 in the morning, when the CB came alive with a voice I didn't recognize. Deep, unhurried, with the Midwest flatness of a man who'd grown up somewhere without hills. "Anybody westbound running the 80? Long night out here." I keyed the mic. "Westbound. Past the 34 exit, what have you got? Nothing, just talking. A pause. You married? I laughed, the specific involuntary laugh of a man caught off guard by a direct question. 8 months, I said. You? 22 years. A pause. It get easier. The marriage or the road? The combination. I thought about that. The Nebraska night was total around the truck, just the road in the headlights and the CB voice and the question hanging in the air between us. I don't think easier is the right word, I said. Different. You get better at the parts you're bad at, and the parts you're still bad at, you at least know what they are. What are you still bad at? Transitioning. Coming back from the road and being fully back takes me a day. 2 days for me, he said. 22 years and still 2 days. Does she know? She knows. She built around it. Gives me the first day, fully present by the second. A pause. Smart woman. Sounds like it. Your wife know? She knows, I said. We talked about it on the first date. A longer pause this time. First date, he said. You told her on the first date. She asked the right question, I said. What was the question? What's the hardest part of the job? He was quiet for a moment. The CB static filled the gap the way it does. Not silence, just the ambient sound of an open channel waiting for the next transmission. My wife asked me that 30 years ago, he said. Before we were married. I told her the hours. Was that the wrong answer? It was the incomplete answer. The hours were the symptom. The transition was the thing. A pause. She figured it out eventually. Took her longer than it should have because I didn't have the word for it. We drove in parallel for a while. I couldn't see his truck. He was somewhere ahead of me or behind me in the dark, running the same road in the same direction for his own reasons. 22 years, I said. What's the thing you'd tell someone 8 months in? He didn't answer immediately. I could almost hear him thinking. Stop treating the road like a separate life, he said finally. It's part of the same life. The sooner you fold it in, the sooner she's part of it instead of outside it. I drove with that for a few miles. How do you fold it in? I said. Bring her on runs, he said. Let her see the world from up there. Once she's seen it from the cab, she's got a reference. She knows what you're talking about when you talk about it, and you know she knows. I thought about Claire on the October run, the Nebraska light, her hand in mine for 15 miles. Same light. Already doing that, I said. Good. A pause. You're going to be fine. He clicked off. The channel went back to static. I drove the remaining miles to the North Platte exit and pulled off for fuel and sat in the cab for a few minutes before I got out. The Nebraska 2 in the morning dark was total and cold, and the only sound was the engine and the wind off the plains. I texted Claire, somewhere in Nebraska. Good CB conversation, thinking about you. She was asleep. The response came 4 hours later, when I was back on the road. I was thinking about you, too, probably at the same time. I don't know his name, I don't know his truck, his carrier, his run. I know he'd been married 22 years and had been 2 days on the transition for all of them and had a smart woman who'd built around it. I hope he's still on the road. I hope she's still there when he gets home. The channel is always open. That's the whole infrastructure. An open channel, a clear signal, and someone on the other end who's listening. That's all it takes. That's everything. The middle is harder to tell, because the middle is where the road is most present and most difficult, and I want to be honest about it rather than skip to the ending. Claire and I dated for 14 months before I asked her to marry me. In those 14 months she met the Peterbilt before she met my mother. Not because I was keeping my mother from her, but because the Peterbilt was in Omaha and my mother was in Ames. And the practical geography of a long-haul driver's life meant that the truck was the context in which most of our early time together happened. She came on a run with me in October, 6 weeks into dating. Not a long one. Omaha to North Platte and back, a day run, 8 hours. I wasn't sure she'd say yes when I asked, because climbing into an 18-wheeler cab for 8 hours is a specific proposal and not everyone's version of a good time. She said yes without hesitating, which told me something I filed away. She was a good passenger, not the kind that needs to fill every silence, the kind that can be in a space without requiring it to produce something. We talked when we wanted to and didn't when we didn't, and she looked at the Nebraska landscape with the attention of someone genuinely seeing it. And somewhere west of Columbus she said, "I understand why you do this." I asked her what she meant. "It's clean," she said. "You go somewhere and you come back, and the thing you went there to do is done. There's no ambiguity about whether it worked. The load is either there or it isn't." "That's most of it," I said. "What's the rest of it?" I thought about that for a while. The I-80 west of Columbus is open country, flat and wide, the kind of road that doesn't require much of you and gives you space to think. "The rest of it is this," I said. "The specific quality of the road at this hour in this light, the way it looks from up here. Most people don't see the world from this height." She looked out the windshield for a while. "I can see that," she said. "That's worth something." That October run is the one I think about most when I think about the early months. Not the first date, not the first time I told her I loved her, not the proposal, that run. 8 hours, Omaha to North Platte and back, Claire in the passenger seat of the Peterbilt 379. The Nebraska October doing its thing with the light and the wide sky. That's the run where I understood that this was a different thing from the two relationships that had ended at the intersection of absence and silence, because Claire had looked at the road from the cab and understood it rather than resented it. And that understanding was not nothing. We married in June. Not a big ceremony. Claire had wanted something small, and I had no preference except that it be real, by which I meant that the words said should correspond to something actual rather than to something performed. 15 people in a park in Omaha, a judge who'd done 300 ceremonies and delivered ours with the specific warmth of someone who had stopped finding the repetition deadening and had found it instead clarifying. Claire wore a dress that was blue rather than white, which suited her, and she looked at me through the whole ceremony with an expression that I can only describe as the expression of a person who has made a decision and is not second-guessing it. I said the words, and I meant them. All of them, including the ones about hard times, which I said with the specific awareness of a man who knows something about hard times and knows that meaning them in advance is different from meaning them when they arrive. The Peterbilt was in the lot across the street from the park. I'd driven it to the ceremony because it was a work day. I had a load running the next morning, and the truck needed to be staged. And afterward, when the 15 people had dispersed to a restaurant down the block for dinner, Claire and I stood by the driver's side door for a moment alone. She put her hand on the cab. "Witness," she said. "Technically, it was parked across the street," I said. "It was there," she said. "That counts." Dome. The first year of marriage had the specific texture of two people learning the rhythm of a life that one of them is in intermittently and the other is in constantly. Claire is precise about her needs. It's one of the things I found immediately and still find true about her. The clarity with which she can name what she requires, which comes from the therapist appointments on Thursday afternoons, and from a natural disposition toward honesty with herself that I don't fully share and that I admire, in the way you admire something in someone else that you know you could use more of. What Claire required in the first year was communication. Not constant communication. She wasn't asking me to call from every truck stop, wasn't asking me to account for my hours in a way that would have felt like surveillance rather than connection. She was asking for a version of presence that didn't depend on physical proximity, a text at night when I was parked, a call on the long runs when there was time. The understanding that being on the road was not the same as being gone, and that the distinction required maintenance on my end. I was not naturally good at this. That's the honest version. I'd spent 16 years developing the habit of the road as its own world, complete, self-contained, sufficient. And the habit of that world is that you come back and you account for yourself when you get there, not in the intervals between. I'd told myself this was independence. Claire showed me, without making it a confrontation, that it was also a wall. The showing happened slowly. She didn't give me a speech. She didn't issue an ultimatum. What she did was this. When I came home after a long run and she was quieter than usual and I asked what was wrong, she told me. Directly and without drama, I felt like you were somewhere else this week and I missed you in a way that I couldn't reach. Not an accusation, a statement of fact, the way she stated most things. I sat with that the first time. I didn't respond well. I said something about the load having been complicated and the schedule tight, which was true and also beside the point. She let it go for that day. But the next week, when I was on the I-80 westbound, and the run was straightforward, and the Nebraska evening was doing its thing, I called her. Not because something had happened, just because I was there and she was there, and the call was what the gap between us required. She answered on the second ring. I'm somewhere in the middle of Nebraska, I said. The corn's all in. The sky's doing that thing. She was quiet for a moment. What thing? The pink and orange thing. The thing it does when the sun's almost down and the flat land catches it from the side. I've never seen that, she said. You saw it from the truck in October. From inside the truck. A pause. It looked different from in there. Better or worse? Different, she said. Higher. We talked for 40 minutes. I was parked at a rest area east of North Platte by the end of it. The sky fully dark, the CB quiet. She told me about a difficult project meeting and a colleague who was testing her patience and a dinner she was planning for the following Saturday. I told her about a shipper in Denver who'd renegotiated the rates and about a rest area in Utah that I'd been to once in 2019 that had a view of the Wasatch Range that I'd been thinking about since. Why were you thinking about it? She said. Because you'd like it, I said. I kept thinking I should have had someone with me. A pause, short, a beat. Take me sometime, she said. I said I would. And I meant it in the way that you mean something when it arrives as a sentence before you've decided to say it, which is the most reliable kind of meaning. That was the call that shifted something. Not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself as a turning point. Just, after that call, the wall was shorter. I could still feel it. But it was shorter, and I'd built part of it myself by making the call instead of waiting until I got home. The year that followed that call was the year the marriage found its shape. Not the shape we'd imagined in June. I'd been naive about how much work the shape would require, and I think Claire had been generous in her expectations in a way that cost her something in the months before the shift. But the shape we arrived at was real, and it was ours, and it had been built by two people who had decided, independently and then together, that the distance was a condition of the life and not a verdict on the love. Claire started coming on runs occasionally. Not every week, her job didn't allow that, and neither did the practicalities of a working freight operation. But once a month, sometimes twice, she'd clear a Thursday and Friday and ride with me on whatever run fit the timing. She became a good student of the road. She learned to read the CB, learned the way station procedure, learned why fuel stops matter and how to time them. She asked Carl the mechanic questions about the Peterbilt that I'd never thought to ask, and Carl answered her with the rare loquaciousness of a man who is asked about his subject by someone who genuinely wants to know. The run I think about most from that second year is an October one, a year after the first run, the same general corridor, the Nebraska October light, doing the same thing it had done 12 months before. We were westbound on the I-80 past Columbus, and Claire was in the passenger seat reading something on her phone, and I was watching the road, and the light was going the way it goes at that hour in that country, and I said, "Same light." She looked up from the phone, looked out the windshield. "Same light," she said. We didn't say anything else for a while. The road ran west into the last of the sun, and the corn was down, and the fields were the colour of the sky at the edges, and the Peterbilt held its speed, and the CB was quiet, and the cab had the quality it has sometimes, on the right run at the right hour, of being exactly the right size for what it contains. I reached across and took her hand. She let me. We drove like that for about 15 miles without saying anything. Then she said, "This is it, isn't it? Not a question, a recognition. This is it," I said. "There are things I'm still not good at. The texting from the road is better than it was, but not as consistent as she'd like. The coming home transitions, the recalibration between road mode and home mode still requires more patience from her than it should, because I'm slow at it, because 16 years of self-sufficiency doesn't evaporate on the off-ramp. There are weeks when the distance is harder than others, when the gap between the road world and the home world is wider and takes more effort to bridge. I don't think that goes away. I think it's the condition. What we've built around the condition is the thing I wouldn't have known how to build at 39, before the Dodge street light, before the 400 miles, before the note I held up through the cab window that she didn't take. About the note. She told me maybe 6 months into dating why she hadn't taken it. She'd seen it. She'd read it from the car window. She had good eyes, she said, good enough to read the writing through 2 panes of glass at a green light. She'd read it, and she'd driven away, and she'd thought about it for 3 days before deciding to save the number from the photo she'd taken of it. The photo. She'd photographed the note through the cab window at the green light before she'd driven away. I stared at her when she told me this. "You photographed it?" I said. "I wanted to think about it," she said. "I didn't want to lose the number while I was thinking." "That's the most you thing I've ever heard," I said. She smiled. Not the surprised laugh from the first phone call. Something older than that, warmer. "I didn't say I wasn't interested," she said. "I said I wanted to think about it." The photo is still on her phone. She showed it to me once, my handwriting small and slightly rushed because I'd written it in a moving cab, the fold lines from where I'd creased it. She's kept it for 8 years. I find that more moving than I know how to say, which is fine because not everything needs to be said. The Peterbilt 379 has 492,000 miles on it. I had Carl go through it in the spring, and his report was what it always is. Clean, with specific items to monitor, and nothing requiring immediate action. He said, "You've got more road in this truck if you keep doing what you're doing." I said I intended to. Claire and I have been married for 8 years. We live in Omaha, in a house with a lot that's big enough for the Peterbilt when it's home. The neighbors have adjusted to this. Most of them have stopped commenting on it. One of them, an older man named Harold, who lives 2 houses east and who has been in Omaha his entire life and who considers himself an authority on what does and doesn't belong in a residential neighborhood, still remarks on it occasionally, and I have learned to receive these remarks with the specific equanimity of a man who has made his peace with Harold and is not going to move the truck. The I-80 corridor through Nebraska is still my primary run. I know it the way I know my own hands, which is to say, I know it well enough to know when something is different. The light in October, the corn in August, tall enough to close the road into a green corridor. The specific quality of a rest area at 2 in the morning, when the only sound is the engine cooling and the CB static. I've driven this road for 16 years, and I'll drive it for more. And the fact that someone is at home waiting is not a thing I take for granted anymore. Claire had a theory early on about why the bumper sticker had caught my attention before she had. She said, "The bumper sticker told you I was someone who was paying attention to where she was and wishing she was somewhere else. And that's the posture you recognize because it's yours. I thought about that for a while. I said, I'm not sure I'd describe my posture that way. She said, you're on the road 80% of the time, and the other 20% you're somewhere else in your head. I don't mean it as a criticism, I mean it's why the bumper sticker caught your eye. She wasn't wrong. She has a way of not being wrong that I've stopped being surprised by and started being grateful for, which is a change that took some years. The last time I sat at the 72nd and Dodge intersection was 3 weeks ago, Thursday afternoon, 4:15, coming through on the way to the I-80 on-ramp for a Denver run. The light cycled red, and I sat in the cab and watched the cross-traffic and the heat shimmer off the hood. And I thought about August 11 years ago, the red Civic, the broken mirror, the internal conversation. I texted Claire from the red light at 72nd and Dodge, thinking about you. She texted back 17 seconds later, I know, you always do. The light turned green. I put the truck in gear and headed for Denver. The channel is open. The road keeps going. The Peterbilt has more miles in it. That's the whole story, which is also to say it isn't a story that's over. It's one that's still running, the way the good ones do, one delivery at a time, one Thursday afternoon at a time, the light always changing from red to green eventually, and the horizon always there at the end of whatever stretch you're on. If you rode this one all the way to Denver, thank you. Drop a comment before you go. Is there a moment in your life that turned on something as small as a red light? I want to hear it. Subscribe before you leave. The next story is a completely different road, a completely different kind of weight. A driver who's nothing like me, but the cab is always the same size, and what you find in it is always your own. Roll safe. Take the long way home sometimes. And there are parts of this story I've been telling in the shape of a smooth arc, which is the way you tell a story when you want it to be understood rather than simply witnessed. The smooth arc is accurate in its essentials. It's incomplete in its texture. Let me go back and fill in some of the texture, because the texture is where the truth actually lives. The 14 months between the diner and the proposal were not uniformly good. I want to say that plainly before I describe any more of the good parts, because a story that leaves out the friction isn't a love story. It's an advertisement. Claire and I had friction, and the friction was specific and instructive and almost ended things twice, and both times it ended things for the same basic reason, which was that I didn't know how to be present for someone while being absent, and I hadn't admitted to myself that not knowing was a problem. The first time was 4 months in, November. I'd been on a hard stretch. The Denver corridor in November has weather issues that the I-80 through Nebraska doesn't always have, and the week had been a series of weather delays and reroutes and a mechanical issue with the trailer brakes that had cost me a day in a shop outside Cheyenne. By Friday, I was tired in the specific way that a hard week on the road produces, not just physically, but the kind of tired that makes your social capacity contract to almost nothing. I came home to Omaha, to Claire's apartment, where I was staying more nights than not by that point, and I didn't call before I arrived, and I arrived at 9 in the evening when she'd been expecting me at 6, and she'd made dinner that was now 3 hours old. And she'd spent 3 hours in the specific state of a person who is trying to decide whether to be worried or angry, and hasn't had enough information to decide. She was both. She handled it by being quiet, which is her first response to being both things at once. She goes quiet and precise, which I had not yet learned to read correctly. I read it as composure, and responded to it as if composure was what was required. I ate the cold dinner and said it was good, and told her about the Cheyenne shop and the brake issue and the weather on the I-80, and I went to bed at 10:30 because I was tired. In the morning, she told me what those 3 hours had been like, not in the way of an accusation, in the way of a report. Here is what happened. Here is what I felt. Here is what was missing. She said, I didn't know if you were delayed or if you were in a ditch somewhere on the I-80. And the difference between those two things is significant, and a text would have been enough. I said, I should have texted. She said, yes. We sat at her kitchen table with the November Omaha morning coming in through the window, and she looked at me with the expression that I've come to recognize over 8 years as her version of full attention. Direct, undecorated, willing to hear what comes next. I need to know you're there, she said. Not all the time. I'm not asking for all the time. I'm asking for a signal. Something that says I'm here and I'll be there when I said I'd be there, or if not, here's why not. I can do that, I said. I know you can, she said. I'm asking you to decide that it matters. That distinction between can and decide is the one that stayed with me. I drove to Denver 2 days later, and I texted her from the rest area east of North Platte, and from the Cheyenne fuel stop, and from the Denver staging lot. Not long messages. 5 words, 10 words, the trucking equivalent of a lighthouse signal. I'm here. Running on time. Weather's fine. She responded to each one. Small responses. Not effusive. Claire isn't effusive, and I'd have found effusive harder to receive than what she actually sent, which was good and okay. And once, when I texted from the Denver lot at 6 in the morning in the cold, the mountains look unreal today, she sent back, show me. I took a photograph of the Front Range at dawn from the staging lot, and I sent it to her, and she sent back 3 words, worth the drive. That was November. That was the first course correction. The second time was in March, 7 months in. This one was harder. I'd been offered a contract extension by my primary carrier that would have added 2 runs per week and increased my revenue by roughly 30% over the following year. The runs were the Denver corridor and a new Kansas City loop. Good freight, good rates, the kind of contract that a solo owner-operator running a 12-year-old Peterbilt takes when it's offered, because the offer won't wait and the margins don't always stay comfortable. I signed it before I told Claire. I told her 4 days later, not because I'd been hiding it, but because I'd processed it as a business decision, and business decisions were mine to make, and I hadn't yet fully understood, not in the operational lived sense, that a business decision that doubled my time on the road was also a relationship decision and required the same conversation. Claire was quiet for a long time after I told her. Then she said, "How many more days per week?" I told her. She nodded. She looked at the table. She said, "I need to think." She thought for 3 days. I drove to Denver and back, and she was thinking, and I gave her the space she asked for and spent the drive going back over the conversation, looking for what I'd done and finding it quickly, which is the particular clarity that 300 miles of open road gives you when you're trying to figure out where you went wrong. What I'd done was decide without consulting. Not because I was indifferent to her, because the categories in my head were still organized around the premise of a solo operation, where business decisions were mine and personal decisions were mine, and the 2 categories only overlapped when I made them overlap. I hadn't yet reorganized around the premise of a partnership, where a decision that changes the shape of our shared life is a shared decision regardless of which category it technically falls into. She called me on the 3rd day from her car, which I now know means she needed to be moving to have certain conversations. She said, "I want to be with you, and I want you to keep doing what you do, and I also need to be part of the decisions that change what our life looks like. Not veto power, just tell me first." I said, "I hear you. I'm sorry I didn't." She said, "I know you do. That's why I called. I called the carrier and amended the contract, not cancelled, amended. 1 additional run per week rather than 2, which was still a meaningful income increase and a manageable schedule increase, and which I'd negotiated before I called Claire to tell her, so that when I told her, I could tell her the whole thing rather than just the error. She listened to all of it. Then she said, "You amended it before you told me." "Yes," I said. Why? Because I wanted to bring you the corrected version, not just the mistake. A pause. Short. That's very you, she said. Good and infuriating in equal measure. I know, I said. Working on it. She laughed, the surprised kind again, the one that escapes before she decides to let it out. I'd been making her laugh like that since the first phone call, and I wasn't tired of it. Now let me tell you about my mother. My mother's name is Ruth Decker, and she lives in Ames in the house where I grew up, which she has been in since 1974, and which she will be in until the day she isn't, because Ruth Decker does not move from things she's decided to stay in. She's 74 years old, with my father's blue eyes that I inherited, and she has a quality of stillness that I've spent my whole life trying to understand. The stillness of a woman who decided early what her values were and has never needed to revisit the question. She'd been skeptical of the relationships that had ended, not vocally. My mother doesn't offer unsolicited opinions about her children's romantic lives because she understands that unsolicited opinions about one's children's romantic lives are a form of interference, even when they're accurate. But I knew her skepticism the way you know your parents' feelings about things, even when they don't say them, from the quality of her silences and the specific questions she asked. When I told her about Claire, not on the phone, in person, driving up to Ames on a Saturday in December, 3 months after the diner, she listened to the whole account, which took longer than I expected because I kept adding details that seemed relevant, and at the end she asked 3 questions. The first was, what does she do for work? The second was, does she understand what you do? The third was, does she make you want to come home? I answered all 3. The third answer took me the longest, not because I didn't know the answer, but because I hadn't put it in those terms before, and the putting of it in those terms was its own thing. Yes, I said. She makes me want to come home. My mother nodded. Good, she said. That's the one that matters. She met Claire in February at a Sunday dinner in Ames that Claire drove 2 hours for in a snowstorm because I'd told her my mother had made her pot roast, which is the specific food my mother makes when she wants to indicate that the occasion merits effort. Claire ate 2 helpings and complimented the method and asked my mother a question about the recipe that led to a 40-minute conversation that I was not included in, which is the highest possible form of approval from Ruth Decker. In the car, back to Omaha, Claire said, "Your mother is incredible." "She is," I said. "She asked me if I understood what you do." "What did you say?" I said I was learning. A pause. She said, "That's the right answer. The ones who think they already understand it are the ones who leave." I drove for a while with that. "She said that?" I said, word for word. Claire looked out the window at the Iowa dark, the snow in the headlights. "I think she's been waiting a long time to say it to someone." I thought about the relationships that had ended, about what my mother had observed over the years from the Ames house, saying nothing, about the question she'd asked me, "Does she make you want to come home?" and what she'd understood about what that question meant that I'd understood less well. Ruth Decker doesn't offer unsolicited opinions, but she offers the right questions at the right moments, and she'd been doing it my whole life, and I'd been learning, slowly, to hear them correctly. The first Christmas of our marriage, I was on the road. I want to be clear about this because it matters. I was on the road by choice, not by circumstance. The run was optional. I could have declined it. The schedule wasn't mandatory. But it was a good contract, and December freight pays well, and I took it. And Claire and I had discussed it, and she'd said she understood, which she did, and she'd also said it was going to be a strange Christmas, which it was. I was westbound on the I-80 Christmas Eve, somewhere in Nebraska, with a load of manufactured goods heading for a distribution center in Denver that needed to be there for the post-Christmas fulfillment surge. The highway was quiet the way it's quiet on holidays. Less traffic, the ones who are out there running with a specific purpose, the gaps between vehicles longer than usual. The Nebraska sky was doing the winter thing, which is different from the summer thing. Lower, greyer, the clouds sitting heavy over the plains, a few flurries coming off and on since Grand Island. I called Claire at 9 in the evening from a rest area near Kearney. She was at her parents' house in Council Bluffs, at the Christmas Eve dinner that her family did annually, which involved her mother's cooking and her father's opinions about the news, and her younger sister, who was in from Minneapolis and who I'd met twice and liked. She answered on the second ring. "Merry Christmas," I said. "Merry Christmas," she said. "Where are you?" "Kearney rest area. Snow coming on and off. Nothing serious." "Are you okay?" "I'm fine." "How's dinner?" She told me about dinner, the food, the family conversation, a specific exchange with her father about infrastructure spending that had been more animated than the topic seemed to warrant. I listened and watched the snow come in off the plains in the rest area lights and thought about Claire at her parents' table in Council Bluffs, 40 miles east of where I was parked, 200 miles between us. "I wish you were here," she said, not reproachfully, just stating it. "Next year," I said. "You said that last year about Thanksgiving." "I kept the Thanksgiving promise," I said. "I'll keep this one." A pause, then, "I know you will." Another pause. "Joe?" "Yeah. I don't need you to be someone different than you are. I just need you to know I notice when you're gone." I sat with that in the cold rest area, with the snow coming in and the CB quiet and the Peterbilt idling behind me. "I know you do," I said. "I'm sorry it's Christmas." "Don't be sorry," she said. "Just come home when you can. I delivered in Denver on Christmas morning. I was back in Omaha by 9 o'clock Christmas night. Claire was home from Council Bluffs, and she'd left the porch light on. And when I pulled the Peterbilt into the lot and walked to the front door, she opened it before I knocked, which means she'd heard me coming, which means she'd been listening. We had a late Christmas dinner at 10 o'clock at night, reheated from something she'd brought back from her parents' house, and we sat at the kitchen table and talked for 2 hours about nothing urgent. The run, her family, a movie she'd seen, a book I'd been listening to on the long stretches, the ordinary inventory of 2 lives that had been separate for 4 days and were now in the same room. That was the whole Christmas. Dinner at 10 o'clock, the ordinary inventory. It was enough. It was more than enough. That's the thing I keep trying to say about this life and about Claire and about what the Peterbilt has witnessed. Enough doesn't mean everything. It means the thing that's actually present is sufficient for the moment it's present in. Not sufficient for every moment, not sufficient as a substitute for the moments when it isn't there, but sufficient for itself. The road gives you that, if you let it. The specific sufficiency of the present moment, the run you're on, the light that's happening right now, the voice on the other end of the phone from a rest area in Kearney on Christmas Eve. Not everything. Enough. I have a photograph on the visor of the Peterbilt. Not my parents. Claire from the October run 3 years ago, sitting in the passenger seat with the Nebraska Flint Hills in the background, looking at something out the window that she found worth looking at. I didn't tell her I was taking it. She found out when she saw it on the visor on the next run. She said, "You put a picture of me in your truck." I said, "You're in my truck all the time anyway." Seemed right to make it official. She looked at the photograph for a moment. Then she said, "I look like I'm somewhere else in my head." I said, "You were. That's why I took it." She looked at me. "That's very you," she said. "I know," I said, "working on it." She laughed. "The escaped kind. The photograph is still on the visor. It'll be there as long as the truck runs, and the truck will run as long as I take care of it. And I intend to take care of it. Roll safe. Text when you get there."